When it comes to car manufacturing, Germany has always been the top student. They've simply been the best. Up until a few years ago, this was still very much a thing. Today, the German car industry is in serious decline. Volkswagen recently announced it's cutting 50,000 jobs by 2030. BMW, Porsche, and Mercedes all reported profit drops of between 25 and 40% in a single quarter. And since 2019, the German car industry has lost over 110,000 jobs in total. This is not due to some unforeseen market shift just making it so. It didn't have to be this way. In fact, it would not have been this way had it not been for deliberate choices by German politicians and industry leaders. So, what on earth is going on? Let's find out. The craziest part about the German decline is that it was completely avoidable. The disaster can be traced back to the early 2010s. By then, it was obvious that electric vehicles were a real market. Tesla had launched in 2008, and they had started to take the world by storm. EVs were the future. And that future was coming fast. That was the word on the street. The German industry giants had everything they needed to win that future. They had the best engineers, more capital, and more factories. They had brand names that people trusted in every corner of the globe. If anyone in the world were going to lead the electric transition, it was them. So why didn't they? Simple. They were making an extraordinary amount of money from combustion engines, and pivoting to electric meant blowing up their entire business model. Because making electric vehicles is completely different from making OG cars. You need new supply chains, retrain your entire workforce, build a manufacturing process from scratch. All these things that eat up a massive amount of time and money. And to focus on that, while the combustion business was still printing money, sounded more like a headache than it did an opportunity. But even if the transition would have been smoother than making a ham sandwich, it still wouldn't have been that lucrative. Because EVs are fundamentally less profitable. Their engines are mechanically simpler. There are fewer parts, which means fewer clutch replacements, oil changes, or timing belt fixes, all of which brings in additional revenue to the company. So, switching all of their focus to EVs would mean destroying a money printing machine, a machine that was still running fine. So, the industry leaders kept finding reasons to wait one more year. They even took up lobbying to prevent the EV transition. Throughout the 2010s, German car makers pushed hard against tighter EU emissions targets, arguing timelines were unrealistic, consumers weren't ready, or that jobs would be lost. All of this bought them more time to sell combustion. Volkswagen took it further than lobbying. They cheated. Defeat device software was secretly installed across 11 million cars worldwide. This was code designed to detect when a car was being emissions tested, so that they could clean up the results, then pollute normally the rest of the time. Real-world nitrogen oxide emissions were up to 40 times the legal limit. This turned into a massive scandal. When US researchers caught it in 2015, the cover-up went into overdrive. They sent out Oliver Schmidt, a senior Volkswagen executive, from Germany to Michigan to personally lie to California regulators and convince them the excess emissions were a technical glitch, not a deliberate fraud. They claimed it was nothing to worry about. That executive was later arrested while on holiday in Miami and sentenced to 7 years in an American prison. Following the scandal, the Volkswagen CEO resigned, and the company paid over $25 billion in fines. All in all, the German car makers were trying to prolong the combustion dominance for as long as humanly possible. Meanwhile, something was brewing in China. BYD, a Chinese EV manufacturer, had spent the entire previous decade doing one thing: getting really, really good at building electric cars. This company was backed by massive state subsidies, with no legacy combustion business to protect and no shareholders demanding short-term profits. By the early 2020s, they were producing vehicles with genuine range, solid build quality, and advanced battery technology. Their BYD Seal arrived in Europe priced around 33,000 euros. A comparable Volkswagen would cost you thousands more. An army of Chinese manufacturers were right behind them, all with similar cost structures, all salivating over that same European market. At first, German car makers weren't worried, but they probably should have been. By 2023, Chinese EVs had started arriving in Europe in serious numbers. BYD, Geely, and SAIC were all offering electric cars at prices European manufacturers simply couldn't match. European car makers were losing ground at home. It was becoming clear that this wasn't a temporary disruption. The Chinese had arrived to dominate. So the European Commission stepped in. It proposed tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. The goal was to give our home team a fighting chance. It made a lot of sense. The Chinese government had been subsidizing its car industry for years. It was thanks to the state money flowing into BYD and others that allowed them to price below what any European manufacturer could match. Tariffs would level the playing field and give European car makers some breathing room to catch up. Most EU members supported it. The United States had already done exactly the same thing. Germany voted against it. On the surface, this makes no sense, but they had their reasons. You see, for decades, one of Germany's most profitable car markets was in fact China. Their Chinese operation was one of the most lucrative ventures in global business. All the big guns, Volkswagen, BMW, and Mercedes, had built entire manufacturing empires there. They had local factories employing tens of thousands of people in China. At their peak, Volkswagen alone was selling over 4 million cars a year in China and generating around 4 billion euros annually from those joint ventures. The Chinese market wasn't a side business, it was the business. But all of it was hostage to Beijing's goodwill. If the EU imposed tariffs on Chinese EVs, Beijing would retaliate. Licenses would get complicated, inspections would multiply, joint venture partners would become less cooperative. The market that had been printing money for 30 years could turn hostile overnight. German car makers had spent decades building something enormous in China, and now that whole shtick was at risk of collapsing. So BMW and Volkswagen executives went directly to then-Chancellor Scholz. They lobbied him heavily to not jeopardize their Chinese business. Reported at the time by outlets like the Financial Times, Germany's opposition to the tariffs was explicitly and publicly linked to automotive industry lobbying. Scholz listened, and Germany voted no. The tariffs that eventually passed were watered down. BYD ended up with a 17% rate, not enough to close the price gap, and BYD had already started building a factory in Hungary anyway, specifically to sidestep future tariffs. So what did this mean for Germany? Well, the Chinese manufacturers kept pushing hard into Europe, eating up market share by the day. But this was the least of their problems. Because at the same time, the German dominance in China, the very thing they had sought to protect, had started to wobble. Between 2018 and 2023, Volkswagen sold roughly 1 million fewer cars per year in China. That's a 25% decline in a market that was actually growing. By 2024, BYD had overtaken Volkswagen as China's #1 car brand. That was a position VW had held for 25 years. By 2025, Geely had pushed them into third. So German car makers were now losing in China and losing at home simultaneously. Their lobbying had brought them nothing. Their short-term greed had brought them nothing. Their whole empire was falling apart. The car makers themselves, and the weak Scholz government, had created this messed up situation themselves. So the German car empire is now in serious decline, all because of their own dumb decisions. Volkswagen is said to cut 50,000 jobs by 2030. Bosch, which supplies components across the whole industry, is cutting 22,000. ThyssenKrupp, which makes the steel, is cutting 11,000 jobs. And those are just the headline numbers. Behind every one of those announcements is a supply chain that depends entirely on orders from the big names. You could bet money that smaller companies, like subcontractors and local manufacturers, are losing business too. This is a gigantically big deal for Germany and all of Europe. The entire economy is impacted. Take a trip to the city of Wolfsburg. Here, around 70,000 people work for Volkswagen. The local economy doesn't exist independently of the company. It never had to. The company is the city. If Volkswagen has to close shop, what on earth happens to the city? Multiply it across every factory town in Bavaria, Baden-Württemberg, and Lower Saxony, and you start to understand the scale of what's happening. This isn't one company having a bad decade. It's an entire industrial ecosystem that took 70 years to build, falling apart in real time. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of workers whose skills and careers are built around something that might not exist soon. And it's all because of stupid decisions by naive politicians and greedy corporations. It didn't have to be this way. Germany didn't lose its car industry to bad luck. Volkswagen and BMW had everything they needed to continue to dominate. The decisions that led here were made deliberately, by executives who chose short-term profit over adaptation, and by a government that was too naive. I hate to say it, but the era of German car dominance is probably over. It would take a miracle for the industry to somehow recover. This channel is unapologetically pro-Europe. We don't want to see China take over. We don't want to see Chinese dominance on the roads or in the factories. But except for don't buy the Chinese cars, there might not be much we can do. If you found this interesting, please feel free to subscribe. By staying informed, we can sharpen our European edge. Thank you for watching.